Good day, everyone. Welcome to the second live webinar debate that Diplo organizes. Those of you that had the chance to be with us now almost a month ago for the E-diplomacy day, I hope had a good experience with this kind of a debate, and I'll explain shortly how it works for those that are newcomers. But maybe I'll give a little bit of an introduction of what the topic is first. We witness more and more that diplomacy and the negotiations and diplomatic processes behind the closed doors are not an option anymore. Even if you close the door, most of the things will go out from the meeting via social media like Twitter and so on. There is a tendency to open the archives and various different kinds of data to the public as well for the benefit of all. And those that are probably innovative enough already, the institutions start working on e-participation and remote participation, specifically to involve more people in their activities. Now, our debate today will focus on three topics: on social media, on e-participation, remote participation, and on open data. Diplo Foundation has been involved in e-participation and e-diplomacy after all for more than 10 years, and e-participation has been a strong component of it. We have supported the development of the remote participation working group, which helped the Internet Governance Forum. We also assisted and worked with the ITU, with UNESCO, with many other institutions on e-participation. And we are also encouraging the social media tools in e-diplomacy. Now, I'm taking a stand on one side of this debate, and we'll have some debaters which will try to oppose these arguments. But this webinar is a part of a bigger initiative that we started, which we called E-Participation Month. We started with this webinar to try to debate particular issues on e-participation. On 19th of June, we'll have in vivo the face-to-face event in Geneva, which will bring an addition to this discussion of e-participation, the usefulness of e-participation and the types of. Today with us we have panelists, debater speakers, but we also have, as I said, a number of people. We had more than 100 participants or applicants to participate in the live chat of this meeting. All of the comments that you raised today and that our debaters raised today will get into the research that we will work on in the next month and present during the e-participation day in Geneva in June. So feel free to comment, to give your opinions, and of course raise the questions how it can feed into the debate today. How this particular debate will work. We said that the topic of today's session, or the challenge, would be whether the social media, the open government and open data initiatives and remote participation are opening up international organizations and development agencies, to what extent that's true and to what extent it might not be, and that the increased use of cloud-based technologies is making the organizations themselves more consultative, more open, more transparent. To discuss this, we'll go through three topics, and each of the topics will be discussed, debated in the Oxford debate type of a discussion, where we'll have two sides, one proponent, one opposing the particular argument. Each of them will have 5 minutes to express their positions, and then we'll follow up with your questions, which of course you're encouraged to post throughout the discussion. We'll pick up a couple of questions, put back to the debaters, and give them another 3 minutes to work on or to give you some kind of responses. We'll also organize the poll, the voting, after each of the debates, and you'll be invited by our chat moderators to vote. But take it loosely. The idea of this webinar is more to debate than to find a winning party, even though this gives a bit of the taste and spirit. The combination of the two is quite interesting. We have Google Hangout tool, which we use as the debaters, in combination with Cover It Live, which provides the chat. And finally, of course, Twitter is there, and the EDIP Geneva, hashtag EDIP Geneva is what you can use for the discussion. Now, let me also welcome Ginger Pak and Dan Dincic, who are with us to assist with the chat window. Myself is Vladimir Radunovic from Diplo Foundation, and I'll move on to presenting our first debaters and the first topic. The first topic would be quite challenging, even though maybe I gave my own opinion in the first part. The way the most international organizations and developing agencies are using social media suggests that it's not a true engagement, but simply a broadcast. Is it true or not? Once again, I'll repeat it. So the way the most international organizations are using social media suggests that this is not true engagement, but rather simply broadcast. Supporting this argument, we have Pete Cranston from Diplo Foundation. Opposing this argument, we have Paul Conneally, who is the head of communications of the International Telecommunication Union and a social media advocate who has a long experience with social media and e-tools, but also with big international organizations. I'll give the floor firstly, the 5 minutes to Pete Cranston to try to persuade us that this is true. Pete, your 5 minutes starting now, and I'll feel free to interrupt you after 5 minutes. Pete, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vlada. I'm also fairly active on social media, but I think the proposition is self-evident, as we say in Oxford. So I'm going to show you a presentation. Oops, wrong bit. Broadcasting versus engagement. My proposition is simple. Engagement is the essence of using social media. By that we mean having conversations with people, engaging with audiences internationally, outside of your normal organization, and exchanging information, commenting, disagreeing, laughing. Engagement rests on personalized communication, which generally means between people, but you can get between people and institutions. The nub of this is that the majority of institutions do not allow their staff freedom. They don't give them the space to be personal in social media. They're hamstrung by corporate communication policies, by a variety of procedures, by an organizational culture. There are exceptions. This is not 100%. A lot of campaigners, a lot of brand marketing is more interactive. This is what engagement looks like. This is, all right, so I've chosen somebody fairly extreme. Guy Kawasaki, as it says in the bottom right-hand corner, marketing legend Guy Kawasaki, is very active in Google+. He would be, he works for Google. He's an evangelist, a tech evangelist. But what I've circled there is just the interactions with his posts on Google+. And Google+ isn't known as being a very interactive medium. There are a lot of comments and things that he writes. There are a lot of people who Plus is the Google equivalent of Facebook's like, and who share it. So Guy comes on to the space as himself and has lots of engagement. Perfectly clear he works for Google, but he doesn't come on as Google, he comes on as him, and he has an engaging social media presence. This to me is broadcasting. This is the clip yesterday or the day before from two Twitter streams, #E-diplomacy and #digital diplomacy. And a lot of them, you can see there is a kind of retweeting and stuff, but by and large, it's actually flat announcements. It's announcements from organizations about events. It's announcements that we're sitting in an event, this is what we're doing. There isn't a great deal of back and forth in that kind of operation, and I think that's typical of a lot of diplomacy, and I think diplomatic institutions can be seen as a proxy for a lot of large international organizations. I often praise the Foreign Commonwealth Office, the UK FCO's digital diplomacy, well, at least it's social media efforts. This is his blogging. But I've been looking at it more recently, and this was randomly selected yesterday. And there are 3 top posts on the FCO blogging site, and they're all simply announcements. They're just simply broadcasting in an engaging and fun way. It's much more interesting than a press release. But they're not actually talking to people. They're not having people talk back to them. The key is, for all social media, not the number of followers you have, not the size of your site and your hits, but it's how engaged your followers are. That was just picked up today on Twitter. There are exceptions, classic exceptions. This is Mark McDowell's story in the Canadian Embassy in Beijing. Those are, if you don't know about it, have a look on our blogs. But essentially, they on the Chinese equivalent of Twitter, they put up a picture of the ambassador's car. Huge amount of conversations. Some of it actually quite risky. But as Mark says, his ambassador has a high tolerance of risk, so he was comfortable for Mark to experiment, and as a consequence, they managed to get engagement. But I don't think many leaders in large organisations are tolerant of risk, and I've worked in UN organisations and NGOs and public sector. Diplomatic institutions in particular, they're hierarchical and resistant to change until it's forced upon them. There's also something epochal about this. I don't know if you've read Anne-Marie Slaughter's articles around what she calls a Lego world as opposed to a billiard ball world. Essentially, it's the network world. And what's complex about this, of course, is that in this networked world, the Lego world, institutional boundaries are no longer as, well, they're certainly as clearly defined, but they're no longer as imporous. They're no longer as solid.
Sorry to interrupt you. You have 1 more minute, and note that the presentation has, for some reason, stuck. So keep in mind that you probably don't have a presentation for some reason.
Where did it stick?
Well, it depends. Different people, different. Some first slide, some a bit later, but...
oh, well, that's tragic. You haven't seen my wonderful pictures. I'm just coming to the end of my 5 minutes.
Okay, you get two
Can
more
you see
minutes
that?
to try.
Can you see that?
Yeah, it's okay now. It's okay. Yeah.
So it was the presentation. So give me a spare minute, yeah? Because I was talking about Guy Kawasaki. Sure. That was the Twitter broadcasting. That's the FCO broadcasting. That's the exception. But there is a high tolerance of risk. Not many leaders are tolerant of risk. Institutions are hierarchical, resistant to change. And it's critical at this time because institutional boundaries no longer define the nature of relationships. It's about a network society. So the questions we need to ask, if you accept the proposition that we are in a broadcasting state in large organizations, there are two challenges. How can those with authority, the decision makers, be enabled to understand that the world is changing and that they and their organizations need to change and to relax about it? And the second one is a quote from the Minister of Tourism in Mexico. He's very active on Twitter, but the staff in her department are not active in social media, and the response is, the reflection was, well, how can you get risk-averse bureaucrats who are conditioned as they pass through organisations to be risk-averse? How can you encourage them to be creative and experiment? The end.
Thank you, Pete. In spite of the lack of some slides or a little bit of late slides, you managed to capture it quite right. Number of good arguments. I won't take much time. I would rather give the floor to listen to Paul and Paul opposing these arguments. Paul, 5 minutes are yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Pete. There's definitely a number of points in there that I recognize, but I do think we're in an evolution heading in the right direction. So I get straight into it, given the time constraints. Here at ITU, I mean, we're constantly struggling to keep abreast and to keep developing our on-the-job experience, if you like, on using and choosing the multiple choices of channels available to us. But social media is very much a fundamental part of our overall communication strategy and is set to become even more important. And I think that's an important point at the outset, because for anybody who's responsible for strategic communications, social media and the possibilities that it provides are giving us some of the greatest tools, not just for listening and measuring, but for engaging that we've ever had before. But the three key words for us here in ITU, and I think for generally speaking in social media, would be engagement, conversation, and community. The main channels that we're using are Twitter and Facebook, as well as our blog called ITU for You, and of course YouTube. We have secondary channels as well, including Google+, Weibo, which we started quite recently. Storify is a curation tool which we used a lot, and we also have a closed group on LinkedIn for our members, because we're a membership organization, and that has become a very interesting social space as well. We have a lot of other accounts as well that we use for specific purposes, such as Flickr or Foursquare or SlideShare. But before we look at the importance of social media for engaging external audiences, allow me one moment to talk about engaging internal audiences. Social media is ultimately a conversation, and the more staff in ITU that are engaged with key communities, sharing information, leveraging social media channels of other organizations as well, and finding their own social media voice while amplifying the ITU voice at high-profile events or whatever, the more effective our social media strategy will be. Coming back to our primary way of using social media today, we have two main channels that we're using, and that has as much to do with capacity and resources as anything else. But the more effective channels for us that we find are Twitter and Facebook. Twitter is very much about real-time engagement and conversation. It's true what Pete said about, at live events you can often get a one-way messaging going out, but I think that's also a sign of walls breaking down in organizations. It's live reporting from events that would hitherto have been closed off to a vast majority of communities and stakeholders. We've just had an event, a very eventful week here in ITU with 3 different international conferences, and we've had millions of impressions on Twitter and identified lots of new and interesting communities and gained lots of new followers. So I think it is a form of engagement. But of course for live events it's often quite one way. So we've built up a large community of people interested in our issues, and it requires extensive hands-on investment to continue to nurture and grow the community, and that's an important point. It's very common practice for us to use hashtags to guide the conversation and to engage with specific communities. So for instance, Girls in ICT is a hashtag that we've been using successfully for important and ongoing dialogue on increasing the participation of women and girls in the technology sector. As well as that hashtag around our big events and issues, etc., we also identify and connect far-flung communities who share common goals. So the hashtag around this conversation enables us to convene and curate and connect. We're also leveraging widely used community hashtags on Twitter, such as broadband or mobile or whatever, which puts us into the conversation of the broader community, helps us to position ourselves, helps us to engage with new audiences. Facebook, if I can come to that, is a very community-oriented platform. Best practice shows that less is more. So we tend to limit our posts on Facebook to about 2 per day, so as not to pollute the news feed of subscribers. Sometimes extensive work goes into a single post because we like to ensure that they're compelling, visual, conversational, and our metrics show the issues of most interest are socially oriented issues for our Facebook community. Coming towards my conclusion, I can summarize by saying that the management of our social media channels depends on well-defined strategies and priorities which provide the parameters we need for real-time engagement. This is supplemented by extensive intelligence gathered from a continuous practice of measuring impact, which in turn feeds into our practice. Social media has served to underline as well the importance of partnerships at the heart of any effective communication strategy. When we join forces with partner organizations that share a common goal and we mobilize our respective communities online, this makes for a far greater impact through effective social media engagement while opening up our organization to new communities. A recent example of this for ITU would be a partnership that we just announced with the International Federation of Automobile Associations around the use of ICTs and road safety. So there is today a vast ecosystem of channels available, all of them with certain advantages and disadvantages. We've opted, based mainly on the reality of physical capacity, to focus on the 2 that are proving most successful for us, Twitter and Facebook, while trying to populate and update other channels such as Google Plus and Weibo, which themselves have a huge...
Your time is up.
which have a huge potential. Just a final word. Engagement takes time, and there's nothing more detrimental to your social media standing than blasting out over channels and never engaging with those who respond and inquire. In this sense, social media should ensure that international organizations become great listeners and great engagers over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Well, I tried to give you a little bit of additional time as well, since even though you didn't have a PowerPoint. Thank you for bringing the experience. I did also have a couple of questions in mind, but I see that there are good questions already from the participants on the chat. So I'd rather go in conveying the three questions, which might be interesting to fit in, and then give you back the floor shortly. So Kishan asks, Pete, with a lot of question marks, is it possible that Geneva institutions, well, it's not only for Pete, it's probably also for Paul, even more, is it possible that Geneva institutions can be more transparent? Is it not Geneva too much self-absorbed and kind of a government Geneva-centric, so that it doesn't really ask for too much transparency? But that's probably a bit of political question. Now, Liz Galvez says the following interesting comment. Engagement requires quite heavy investment in human resources. Most diplomatic institutions have cost issues, maybe even the international organizations. And John Harris builds up on that, saying that, besides he agrees with Liz, that the human investment is not usually priority, even in his country, particularly for e-diplomacy. It's simply easier to broadcast. So maybe the question is also to what extent the institutions will have the capacity to engage or push people to engage. And then the last comment is, does the preference for Twitter, that's the question for Paul rather, does the preference for Twitter over Facebook not actually disqualify some less technically equipped communities, having in mind the profile of people that are using Twitter? Does it not stop ITU from engagement with these kind of people that are less techy and try to reach out to the others? I will stop with these three questions. Let me see. There is another last one. Arvin says, "Less is more." We hear that oftenly regarding to the social media and international organizations. Pete, another 3 minutes for you, since you're not going to use the PowerPoint now. 3 minutes is a limit. Pete, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Paul, as well. Very interesting account of what happens in ITU. I mean, I think I have to start with Paul, though. I didn't hear a lot of evidence of engagement. I mean, I had a lot of evidence, I had a lot of stories about the opportunities, the potential for social media, but actually having stories of deep engagement with ITU audiences, you're quite right. Social media is a great listening channel. It's great for organizations to hear from outside, but the kind of engagement, the benchmark I used at the beginning of Guy Kawasaki and lots of other well-followed, well-engaged activists in social media, I've not come across an institution that's got the same kind of profile, and I think there is an issue there. I think Liz and John are right. It's partly to do with cost, and certainly if you're focusing on tools that require internet connectivity, there are areas of the world which are excluded from channels like Facebook and Twitter, though I think the use of mobile phones across the world increasingly as well in sub-Saharan Africa is making that less of an issue, particularly in relation to Facebook. But in terms of Kishan's question, I think it's very interesting. I don't think it's just Geneva, Kishan, which is self-absorbed. I think a lot of what passes for engagement within organizations is talking to your own friends. You'll all have heard of the echo chamber, that if we in Diplo tweet, Diplomacy retweets us, and then Andreas in New York retweets both of us, and then we retweet. There is an echo chamber effect of all these organizations. So within Geneva, the organizations know each other, the communicators know each other. They do each other's favors. I mean, there is an argument, which I would also subscribe to, that retweeting and echoing is a bit like collectively standing in a cave and shouting. Your voice travels further across the valley, and you make a bigger noise in a crowded communication environment. But in terms of real engagement, having people comment on your policies, I mean, diplomatic organizations I wouldn't say pay lip service, that's too unkind, but ministers will have a tweet up, and you'll have a minister and his staff sitting tweeting live from an office in a capital city somewhere. How genuinely interactive is that? I mean, there's a moment there when there may well be awkward questions, and publics will engage with these figures, but by and large, the resource question means that all the attention is focused on getting the message across, making sure there is a large audience, but not in genuine engagement. And that comes back to my original point, which is genuine engagement happens when you liberate your staff. Let your staff free, you let your staff operate. They're intelligent people. They know they want to keep their jobs. They're not going to make lots of mistakes. Let people engage as individuals, and you have much more engagement in organizations.
Thank you,
That's
Pete.
3 minutes.
Thank you, Pete. It was sharp and very good points. Thanks for that. Paul, your final 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Well, the example I used for engagement was linked around a program that we have called Girls in ICT, which is very much about promoting the importance of young girls, particularly how they participate in the technology sector and how they perceive technology as a potential career. And that has been, we put a whole year of investment in engaging online around this issue, and I think with an awful lot of success. We have been meeting lots of fantastic groups all over the world. Most recently, a group in Nigeria who then we invited here to Geneva to work with us, connecting Rwanda with the Solomon Islands, etc. So our job is not just to engage people for the sake of engagement, but it is very much to connect communities as well, so that we're all more aligned around the same issues, that we're moving towards the same solutions. We have a project up and running at the moment where we're planning to crowdsource policy online. And that's something we'll be launching in September, and as far as I'm aware, it hasn't been done to this extent that we're planning it before. And this is all a part of the small experiences we've been having to date, where our experiences with social media and the success of really engaging with different communities, such as civil society, for instance, has definitely contributed to the organization opening up more and becoming less risk averse. We have a fully fledged social media policy. The main pillar of our communication strategy, and it's not just social media strategy, is empowerment of staff, and to enable staff to communicate effectively and safely as well, in the sense that that they understand what the guidelines and the parameters are. Because I had included that in my talk deliberately, because I felt that it's often a community that's overlooked in communication strategies is your own staff. Regarding what was said, one of the people on the chat mentioned that Twitter might be limiting some audiences. I mean, of course, it's not exclusively the only thing that we're using in our global communications outreach. We use many different types of tools, including more traditional mainstream type magazine articles, newsletters, obviously video, all sorts of different types of tools. But Twitter we have found to be quite representative and quite global, and we're also very active now on becoming much more active on other language channels, such as Weibo in China. And that's something that will be only increasing and becoming more and more decentralized as we develop our communication capacities and as staff become more and more engaged. One thing that that was said as well about the high tolerance of risk that is required for an organization to successfully embrace social media. I think that there has been a very steep learning curve in international organizations over the years. I used to work, for instance, with the International Committee of the Red Cross, who 10 years ago their communication strategy was no comment, and now hundreds of their staff are active on social media. They're fully engaging and understanding that it's about engaging with key audiences and audiences of interest that will help them to be better understood, and including the reason that they sometimes say no comment, or that they remain confidential and tight-lipped on certain issues. So it's a way of becoming engagement itself is it's not the act of engagement that is so effective. It's the act of the continuous engagement which feeds into the whole culture of the communication of the organization, and I think that's something that many organizations are heading in the right direction in.
Thank you, Paul. It's really valuable to hear the experiences from an institution who is actually quite successful in this field now. The line is quite tiny between the really seeing if it is an engagement strategy, or if you really succeed with the engagement or not. But I think, and I'll try to do that as a summary while we are finalizing the poll on this. On one hand, what Pete says it makes sense that the engagement is a personalized communication between people rather than institutions, and that you probably have to have people, institutions liberalized enough or free enough to express themselves to a largest possible extent. And on the other hand, we've heard very good experiences and the practical results from the ITU on e-tools like Twitter, Facebook, blogs, especially Twitter. And I think what I liked particularly about your comments, Paul, was the one when you said the engagement takes time. So even if we at the moment say that probably social media is not fully used to a full extent, besides broadcasting by the institutions, it might take time. Also to persuade the leaders within them to invest more in human resources, as we had a comment from the audience. Now, reminding of the poll, which was, once again, the way that most international organizations are using social media suggests that this is not true engagements, but simply broadcast. And the results of the poll currently say, let me see, support of this argument, which would be rather Pete's side, in the sense that the international organizations are not yet using tools for the engagements, but mostly for broadcast, is 69%. Opposing that, which is probably currently more Paul's side, is 13% believe that the institutions already use it for the engagement, and we have 19% of undecided people. The good thing is that, well, first, the good thing is that that we have a number of people which believe that the institutions are effectively and want to use it for the engagement. And secondly, again, back to Paul's comment that it takes time, I think this is a trend, and I hope this percentage of people will help us see the improvements in the future. Okay, I will thank both of you, Paul and Pete, for the excellent debate and your comments. I thank also to the audience for this first part of the debate. We are moving straight to the second part. Paul and Pete, thank you for that. I realized that, Paul, the camera was all the time on you, but you're the real professional, so you didn't move too much left or right. So we're back on the track for the second participation. It says inclusive. To some extent, it's at the first glance it seems quite clear, but I'm sure that we'll have quite interesting opposing arguments. With us today, we have Marília Maciel, who has been working with the IGF. She's from Brazil. She's been working with the Internet Governance Forum, and one of the people who has basically moved the initiative of remote participation and made it work at the Internet Governance Forum of the United Nations. She will support this claim. On the other hand, we have Girardet, who is from Diplo and who used to be working with the IT also. A lot of practical experience with the biggest ITU comes to motivation. Not only that is in favor, so she gets the floor first, but also she's lady. And Marília, 5 minutes, the floor is yours. Try to support it, Marília.
Thank you, Vlada, and good day to all. Well, first of all, remote participation, which is a key concept in our motion, roughly means that someone who is not physically present is able to interact in a constructive way, real time, through the use of appropriate technology. And having this concept, very rough concept in mind, I'd like to support this motion based on 4 main arguments. The first one is that nowadays all international organizations use some kind of remote participation mechanism in their daily work. And I think that Paul has said it very well. Meetings are held between staff members or with experts who are located in different regions. Interagency cooperation is being increasingly unnecessary, and these organizations usually use some kind of remote participation mechanism to do it. So my main point is that remote participation is no stranger to international organizations. They use it for a long time, and as a result of their gradual introduction, silos between organizations are being breached. There are improvements in information management, and this helps transparency. They are more open to collaboration with external people. So when it comes to the routines of international organizations, I definitely think that this statement is true. But let's focus on experiences of remote participation that target a broader and external audience, which I think is our main point here. There are several organizations that have devised strategies for remote participation, such as IGF, ITU, UNDP, ICANN, and these strategies vary, but in general terms, we can say that they combine making information available constantly online with the webcast of meetings, with creating channels to receive inputs. And the reason why I think that the creation of remote participation mechanisms increases both transparency and inclusion together, it's because it triggers a positive change in behavior. When a larger public that did not necessarily see themselves as stakeholders or as concerned people are given the chance to take a look inside the work of an organization, and they realize how the issues discussed there have an impact on their daily lives, and they start to demand more information. It increases social pressure to have access to relevant, reliable, and timely information, not only for accountability reasons, but because people realize they need to stay informed to produce high-quality inputs into the process. So a positive feedback loop is created here. The more participation creates more demand for information, and on the other hand, more information means subsidy for raising awareness and increasing participation. So this is my second point. My third point is a very practical one. Many times remote participation is the only way we have to include some people who otherwise would be completely excluded from the process. Nowadays, we see a proliferation of forums and meetings, and many issues are taken to the international level to be discussed, but they do have an impact on the grassroots level. And in parallel, we see that we still have severe budgetary constraints that would make on-site participation possible. So remote participation is a way to minimize financial and other kinds of constraints as well. And the technologies that are used, like a combination of webcasting and transcripts, they really help the audience to follow the discussions as if they were in the room. Of course, sometimes there are glitches and there are things that need to be improved in terms of methodology, but technology gives a sense of being present in the discussions, and this is really improving over time. My fourth and final argument would be that remote participation enhances inclusion because it facilitates capacity building and it lowers the barriers of entry for newcomers into international processes. The videos and the transcripts, they become available after the meetings as well. And this record of discussions can later on be revisited and consulted, and this becomes very valuable material for capacity building, and it helps to reduce the time of the learning curve for newcomers. So these newcomers feel more prepared, they feel more included, they feel more apt to participate meaningfully, and this ultimately benefits international organizations as well. We were talking about engagement, And engagement is, of course, a top-down process when the channels are open, but it's also a bottom-up process when people realize that they can participate and they can contribute in a meaningful way. They create a network of people that are organized around it and start to participate constantly in international processes. So this will be my first main point. I hope we can discuss a little bit more later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Marília. Very concise, very precise. I guess Guy will have quite a difficult task now to try to bring some counter argument, especially being someone who has been effectively involved in remote participation and work, so he knows that it works. Guy, 5 minutes, floor is yours. Okay.
Thanks, Vlado. Thanks very much, and thank you, Marília, for a very inspiring opening for your statement. As someone who's been very involved in a remote participation project at my last organization, I really want to support this as much as possible. I think the key thing here is, I think the key point to make is what we're talking about here is participation, and what exactly we mean by remote participation. For me, the definition of remote participation is when delegates are actively engaged in meetings which are taking place in a particular area. I wouldn't, for instance, call what we're doing, although this is some kind of virtual participation, I think there's a different sense between remote participation and virtual participation. Remote participation, as we understand it, or I understood it in my last organization, is that when you have delegates meeting physically in one space, in a conference center in Geneva or elsewhere, and you allow delegates to actually enter that space and to try and influence the outcomes of the meeting. And if we understand in that way, I think there are a number of challenges. I think despite all the efforts which are being made from organizations, I think the challenges basically come down, the first challenge basically comes down to the fact these are very different spaces. You have delegates who are physically meeting in a conference room, that's one space, and then you have delegates who are participating or you're trying to bridge the gap through another space, a virtual space, and you're trying to bring these together. And it's actually very complex. It's very difficult to do that. I think the challenges for delegates who are participating remotely in these meetings are really, they're not insurmountable, but they require considerable skill. I think the first challenge comes down to the fact that many of the negotiations that take place actually don't take place inside the conference room itself. You will know very well, of the people who've been following Diplo, who are involved in international relations, will know that a lot of negotiations and discussions take place in the corridors and the coffee breaks, etc. And if you're a delegate and you're participating remotely in a meeting, unfortunately that whole dimension of debate and discussion is lost to you. And so I think that's one of the first constraints. The second constraint is the fact that the delegates themselves are very much at the mercy of the organization who's put in place the remote participation mechanism. I know that when we were organizing, we spent a lot of time training students, what we call remote participation moderators, so that they would be the bridge between the meeting room or the chair and those remote participants. But it's very important for that mechanism to exist, so that as a remote delegate, you can make your intervention in a timely manner, and you can coordinate that with the other people who are participating physically in the meeting. And actually, it's quite difficult to do that, because what will happen is that you have a remote participation moderator sitting in a meeting room, and you may raise your hand in the meeting, in your little web meeting room, and say, look, I'd like to take the floor. But by the time that actually gets through to the chair and he gives you the floor, perhaps the moment's passed. So coordinating interventions is also quite difficult. I'm just having a look at my debating points. The fourth challenge is what I call the time zone hell. And at Marília, for instance, is in Brazil. So fortunately, this meeting is taking place at 3 p.m. in Geneva time. But actually, most meetings in Geneva would start at 9:30. So if Marília was going to be participating as a remote delegate in that meeting, she would probably have to get up at 2 a.m. to be there and to actually participate. So coordinating these meetings with delegates who you're beaming in from different time zones is also really quite difficult. The sixth challenge is that it's really quite difficult to coordinate your interventions with like-minded delegates who are attending the physical meeting. So by that, what I mean is, for instance, you will have the delegates who will be coordinating this out in the corridors, and they will say, right, I will intervene, and then you will support me, etc. As a remote participant, you are not really linked with those delegates, so it's difficult to make that coordination. And then the other challenge is the challenge of languages. So in many of the international meetings, for instance, in the UN, you will have 6 or more languages. And as a delegate, if you're participating physically in the meeting room, you will have access to the interpreters, so you can speak in one of the working languages and have your remarks interpreted. Unfortunately, although I know that the ITU and other organizations are making great efforts to try and bridge that gap, that interpretation is not always available to remote delegates. The other challenge is 2 more challenges which I can see. The first is isolation. It's difficult. I mean, if you're participating remotely in a meeting, that meeting could run out 8-9 hours. You're quite isolated. You're sitting at home and you're trying to engage. But it is a lonely experience to do that. It's a challenge. And then finally, the point I'd make is that and this is something which you've experienced, is that despite the best efforts of what may happen with remote participation moderators, they don't necessarily have control over what happens in the conference room. And we've had cases in the past, for instance, where there'd be a last-minute change to the agenda, and for instance, they decide that they're going to wordsmith the outcome document. This is thrown up on the screen. The delegates who are physically present can see it, but remote participants can't see it, so they're excluded from some very important aspects of the meeting. So in summary, what I'd like to say is that the working like we are, using tools where we're all working virtually, probably works a lot better than when you have delegates who are physically present and you're trying to wed these with delegates who are gathered in a virtual space. And I think that's the main challenge. And I hope we will be able to overcome those challenges. But until that time, I think delegates who are participating remotely have to make an extra effort in order to try and influence the outcomes of the meetings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray. Well, that was quite inspiring. A couple of things that we probably did not think much about. Before moving to the questions from the floor, I will also ask maybe 2 of you within your next round of comments to maybe mention which of these problems or drawbacks of the remote participation can and might and possibly will be overcome by the time with the new technologies and so on, and which could not. For instance, now back to the panel, to the chat window and the questions. Milutin says that one can do corridor conversation remotely too. Now we'll ask him what he means with that, but probably that's also one of the possibilities. It's not the same experience. Then Antoine says remote participation programs and initiatives do make international organizations more transparent. That's what he thinks, because and inclusive, because the jobs done by the international agencies are always checked in real time by the stakeholders worldwide. And now with the new tools, the stakeholders also have more chance to check on the international organizations, so it might be helpful. Deirdre brings her own experience that she spent 3 days in Geneva, virtually last week during the World Telecommunication Policy Forum of the ITU. She was, of course, back home and using the remote participation, but she spent it in a way effectively in the venue. And she says her experience was great most of the time, though we did not ask her what she would think about those problems that you mentioned, like the corridor talks and even the time difference, because she's in Caribbean and so on. And then I think Tim says events do need to facilitate back channels for everyone, not just remote participants, blending online and offline. we do need to build in remote, not just bolt it on, and really develop deep training for blended facilitation and so on and so forth. And the last one is from Liz, who says, I hope you're catching the notes, two of you, because I'm not going to repeat this. Liz says, how do you allow for lobbying, for example, by NGOs, who may be excluded from the informal meetings? Can they do it over the remote participation? How might a remote participation delegate be included in the smoky backroom deal making and so on, which is back to what the guy said when it comes to experience of corridor talks. I'll stop here with questions. I think there are quite some, and this is a provocative topic. Marília, would you like to take your 3 minutes to try to reflect at least some of these points?
Thank you, Vlada. I will start with a point that he has made, that is about negotiations don't usually happen inside conference rooms. And he's quite right, but my feeling is that remote participants rely a lot on their networks to keep them informed about what's going on. So you're never only in the remote participation channel. You are in Skype, you are talking to your constituencies. So I think it helps to bridge this distance and between the conference room and the corridors as well. And there are also positive experiences of remote participation that combine remote participation and physical participation, such as the one that we have in IGF with the IGF hubs. So the hubs are spaces where people follow the discussions, but they are together with their group as well. So they can turn off and the discussion goes on physically, presentially. And we know that some of these hubs have evolved to more structured and official kind of ways of discussing internet governance. Some of them have become ISOC chapters, for instance. So the discussion goes on and it helps to bridge this online, offline spaces. And sometimes we forget that remote participants do have some advantages that on-site participants do not have, such as they can switch rooms, they can see what's happening in different rooms at the same time. They can follow discussions on social media that sometimes when you are in the room and fully paying attention to the people around it, you don't follow it quite often. So you can see the discussions online going on as well, and it's a different way, it's a different narrative about the meetings. The methodology and the training that Pete has pointed out, I think this is an excellent point. It's not sufficient to create the channels and to make people come in. You have to train the moderators, you have to offer trainings for the remote participants so they can use the technology well and they don't get down by the glitches that sometimes happen because of lack of training and knowledge how to use the tools. And Liz has raised a very interesting point about the lobbying. Well, I think that some of that is covered by social media narratives. We have, when huge meetings are taking place and important issues are being discussed, civil society, for instance, organizes Twitter storms to make their voices heard and in a way that it can go into the negotiation room. And sometimes people who are not physically present in conferences, they are home as background people. They are people that draft statements for civil society, for instance, for the ones that are too occupied sometimes in the negotiation table. So I think that they do participate in this lobbying if they are connected and involved in their social networks and with their constituencies. So that would be my remarks.
Thank you, Marília. Before I give back floor to Guy, Milutin just responded, and I think, and it struck additional argument maybe to what Marília said. He said, well, he doesn't know of any example of lobbying or doing the corridor talks online, but one example might be the Skype. And then I recall also, and Marília knows that during the IGF preparations, for instance, during the meeting itself, we coordinate over Skype, which is an invisible way of being in contact during the process itself, which was not possible before. You had to wait for a coffee break, which is probably an argument which also gives space to research. It might be a benefit. Just putting it on the pile of comments that came before, and Guy giving you then the final 3 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Vladimir. Yes, I mean, I find myself being persuaded by Marília's very forceful and arguments. They're very well crafted. I don't know if you can see me. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to talk about inclusiveness. I mean, remote participation doesn't necessarily mean that the meetings are open. For instance, in the last organization I worked for, you had the same restrictions for remote participation as for physical meetings. So only delegates who are registered for a meeting, who had the right to participate, could participate in that meeting, whether it was physical or remote. So there was some accreditation process. So that's the first thing. So it doesn't mean to say that a meeting is open because there's remote participation is present. The second point I make is to talk about the integration between the remote, what I call the remote space, and the physical space. I definitely do think it's a question of improvements. At the moment, for instance, what you find is that, we'll use a tool like WebEx or something else for actually to gather the remote participants. And there's no tool which everyone is present in. And I think that's something which could be done to improve that, so that all delegates, so that if you're remote or if you're physical, you have the ability to negotiate, perhaps behind the scenes during the meeting. And there's not this divide. So I think that's one improvement that could be made. I think also it's just also a question of the type of I would say the maturity of the organization itself. Some organizations are more used to using these tools. They're more used to these type of hybrid meetings, and perhaps they're more comfortable with them. Other organizations are more conservative, and they actually find it a distraction when you have remote participation. You can see it's tolerated, but I've had many instances where the chair, almost refuse. They will reluctantly give the floor to remote participants. They feel perhaps a little bit threatened. So I think that's more to do perhaps with a cultural I would say influence, or rather than perhaps remote participation itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. Well, I won't add anything. I will just move on to the poll and check on the results of the poll. The poll which says remote participation programs and initiatives make international agencies more transparent and inclusive, yes or no? As maybe a short summary before the results, what I picked up from this really, really interesting discussion was that on one hand, apart from everything that we can obviously figure out that remote participation can bring, Marília also noted there are some advantages over in situ participation, like ability to switch the rooms if there are more rooms, ability to more easily follow social media discussions and engage at the same time, discussing groups during the meeting like this, Skyping and so on, and the general advantage for people that are maybe not negotiators themselves, do not need to be in corridor talks, but need to be informed, and because they do the policy draft. On the other hand, Guy mentioned that a couple of disadvantages which are obvious, and we can only think if this is going to change with time, which is the absence of this influence in corridors and corridor talks, which truth is are to some extent the essence of good negotiations. The lack of coordinated response, the time constraints and time zones and so on, language constraints, even this physical and psychological isolation from the room and so on. I definitely missed a good number of good points from both of them, but the archives of this meeting will be available, so we can go through all again and check what we missed. The debate says, or the results of the debate says that Marília won this quite well, which was maybe even expected, in favor of remote participation as assisting international organizations, 71%, opposing it 6%. Well, Guy, you did get something. And well, there is a number of undecided, 24% of undecided. I guess my conclusion can be only that with time we might be able to to even eliminate these effects of remote participation that currently are not advantage towards the in situ. But well, I will basically leave also two of you to work on that. Thank you, Marília. Thank you, Guy. This was really interesting debate. Again, thanks to everyone on the floor and on the chat window that posted questions. We'll move to the third debate easily, and this is the last one. But the question of the third debate is equally interesting, maybe a bit further from what we have been discussing thus far. And it touches upon the open government and open data initiatives. So the question says, open government and open data initiatives are more relevant in a national context than at an international level. We have two debaters in favor of the fact or the claim that the open government and open data initiatives are more relevant on national than on international level is Jovan, the director of Diplo. Opposing this is Tim Davies from Practical Participation Ltd, who also has a lot of experience with the open data initiatives and the whole internet governance process and e-participation and all these e-diplomacy topics. I will leave it to two of you. Jovan, you have the first. You're the first one to have the floor. The five minutes is yours. Jovan, it seems that we don't have your voice. Maybe you have not unmuted your microphone. Still nothing. If you don't manage to put the microphone on, I'll have to give the floor back to Tim before he check if it is unmuted. Well, still cannot hear you. Let me give the floor to Tim, and we'll definitely hear you at any point when you manage to put it on. So, okay, now it may be better. No, still cannot hear you. Let me pass the floor to Tim so that he can start with his 5 minutes. And you can keep on trying, Jovan, and at the moment when we hear you, I'll know that you're back. Tim, now we are switching and starting with the opposing arguments.
So I'm going to try and argue against the motion before we hear it. So I've got some slides that I'll just put up here. And this
I think Jovan did it with purpose. I think this was part of the
was this a plan and a strategy? So
Exactly.
let's see how this works then. So the motion is that open government data initiatives are more relevant in a national context than an international level, and the sorts of things we're talking about here are the pressures on governments or other organisations to share the vast data sets that they hold. So far we've been talking a lot about dialogue and international decision making, and data sets are an important part of how we make decisions, and open data initiatives have been happening at all sorts of levels. And I'm going to try and make three arguments for this happening at an international level. Those are that the real potential of open data as a tool for change is in solving global problems. To do open data effectively, whether at the national level or internationally, needs global standards, and to say actually open data is already being driven at the international level, so we need to engage with that in thinking about how things are being shaped. So the first of those, that open data is key to solving global problems. We've seen over recent years open data being adopted in countries right across the world, boosted by things like the Open Government Partnership, the World Bank sponsoring open data initiatives in developing countries, and a general spread of the open government movement. But many of those country initiatives are perhaps hitting the challenge that people aren't seeing the impact or seeing the return on investment in open data. Certainly in the UK, where I'm based, we're seeing a lot of questions asked about where's the promised benefits of doing this. And I think one of the reasons we're seeing that is because people are looking in the wrong place for the benefits. The real benefits of open data are in solving global challenges, the killer app, as it were, for open data. Data helping us deal with international collaboration about climate change, taxation and fair taxation, or Millennium Development Goals, that's where we see the greatest potential of open data, and we should be focusing attention, and it's an area we're not focusing all that much attention right now. And yet organizations and negotiations are shaped by the information that they have access to. And so if we change the availability of information and data, we can change the way that we enforce international agreements or establish effective cooperation on these issues where we don't necessarily have political integration. So opening up data and sharing resources could be very powerful. To give just one example, that the data we need can come from all sorts of actors, not just from countries, from international institutions, even companies. The Open Knowledge Foundation recently pushed this campaign on open CO2, saying we've passed some milestones in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, we're failing on international collaboration, and we don't have good information or good data on CO2 emissions, whether that's from individual countries' data, from international institutions and the data that they collect, or from companies and other agencies, and focusing on getting people to share the data they have in common ways would be really powerful in addressing these issues. Another example where we're seeing action already is in the International Aid Transparency Initiative, which has already brought together detailed data on aid from hundreds of different donors from a large number of countries and NGOs. And the way it's been able to do that is by attacking this problem on the global scale through global standards. So that point on global standards, then, we can't do open data just by focusing on national initiatives and expecting that these wider benefits will emerge. The claim made for open data is that if you publish things once, then anyone will be able to use it. Publish once, use everywhere. But in practice, say budget data for one country might be published in a very different way to budget information for another, with different categories, labels, and so on. And if we're going to build up and connect up these data sets to address global issues, we need to have global conversations about the data standards we use to tie together these disparate data sets. And that can be really challenging. So we used to address these sorts of problems inside organizations by saying everyone give your data to the World Bank or the UN and they'll sort of reconcile it and match it up. But by doing this in the open, we can involve a whole greater range of organizations and stakeholders in doing that, and do open data in more multi-stakeholder ways. And the last point, and it sounds like Jovan's got his mic working so can respond to these now, is to say that open data is already being driven at that global level. I mentioned the Open Government Partnership. We're expecting in a few weeks' time to hear the UK hosted G8 summit talk about open data and shared principles and standards for doing open data. Institutions like the World Bank are pushing this. So the way that open data happens nationally will be shaped by these international conversations. And even if we want to secure domestic benefits from open data, we've got to focus on the international story and focus on making sure all stakeholders are involved in defining what we're doing. So there's some big challenges there. A quick plug for the Open Data Research Network that I'm now coordinating, where we're trying to address some of these questions and see how can understanding open data at the local level influence these national policy questions. So that's my point. Why is it more relevant at the international level? Because the real problems it can solve are global problems. Data as well as dialogue is key to addressing these, and opening up the data as well as the dialogue at these levels is fundamental.
Overlap of new technologies.
Vlado.
Okay, we can hear you now. Tim, have you finished your part? Should we?
I have indeed, yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That was a very good showcase of the international aspects, and unlike Pete, your presentation was in a big screen. Thank you for that. Jovan, even though you might have missed some of the arguments, some of the Tim's arguments, I'm sure you know them already by heart, so 5 minutes yours to fight in favor.
Thank you, Vlada. Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, Tim, and other colleagues in the panel. You didn't hear what I tried to say at the very beginning, was that I'm like a guy at the disadvantage, and I don't have a very high chance to lose this debate given the powerful arguments for open government and open data. But I will start with Vlada's example when he commented that I did it on a purpose, this technical failure, in order to hear Tim's argument. And it is an example which will in a way be underlying in my discussion. This is the importance of signaling and interpretation. Everything carries some meaning in social communication. Therefore, even these trivial things, and Dan can witness that I didn't do it intentionally, could be interpreted as my attempt to buy some time and to develop counter arguments to ones that Tim proposed. Therefore, this is we live in a highly sort of intensive society, in very intensive communication, and everything, including very positive or trivial or unintentional moves, could be interpreted in different ways. Now, I will marshal three main arguments for the need to focus more on the national level and local level than international level. The first argument is a so-called Copenhagen argument, and I call it Copenhagen because of the climate change conference in Copenhagen, which was held 4 years ago. And if you can recall, one of the reasons for the failure of the Copenhagen conference was the management of expectations. In the preparation, there was a lot of hype, a lot of expectation that in Copenhagen, we could have had a solution for the climate change for the next 20 years. And obviously, the high expectation led to the high disappointment, and climate change community needed approximately 3 years to get back to the year prior to the Copenhagen, to restart discussion, and now to try to build again the policy processes bottom up. My point is that we need more patience, and we need to manage expectation when it comes to open data, and not to move too fast to international level and some sort of a global arrangement as it was done in Copenhagen. This is the first argument. Learn from climate change and learn from the Copenhagen failure. The second argument is related to the fact that open data is closely linked to the local culture, to our cultural settings. Therefore, the closer the open data movements are to the local communities, to the national context, the more likely is that unintended consequences, that we can say collateral consequences of the open data, could be managed in a smoother way. The more we move the open data discussion higher in the hierarchy to international organization, the more likely is that those cultural differences and cultural contexts could not be taken into consideration. Therefore, this is the second argument, that we should keep open data movement closer to the ground, closer to the local communities, and in that sense, integrate it into a way that it can nudge the positive developments and limit some sort of negative consequences. There is a famous example by Professor David Hunt, who who analyzed the open data in crime statistics, and this is the very often quoted example on open data, where you have information about the crime situation in a particular neighborhood. But Professor Hard realized that open data had some sort of unexpected negative consequences. Namely, people, the price and the value of the property of inhabitants in dodgy neighborhoods, if I can call it in this way, realized that with the more reporting of the crime in their neighborhood, the less valuable their property became. Therefore, what was the consequence? That they started reporting less crimes in their neighborhood, and ultimately creating the counter effect to the whole open data movement. The third point, and Vlada is offline, this was intentional, I managed to cut him from the net in order to get more time, is dynamics of international organizations. International organizations, as we heard from Pete earlier, are quite specific setups. They have their own culture, therefore their own dynamics. They have a high sensitivity of national governments for their reputation and the standing. Therefore, the question of the cultural secretariats of international organizations is extremely important. And by building a buy-in on the national level and moving it gradually to international organizations, we can make a more solid open data movement and avoid some sort of a diplomatic positioning that we can expect if open data is parachuted to international organizations without necessary preparation on the national level. And this is extremely important aspect, and by carefully building up bottom-up open data cause for international organization, we can avoid setbacks which are related to specific institutional culture of the diplomatic institutions and international organizations. Vlad, over to you.
Thank you, Jovan. For the records, I was not offline. I just switched off the camera so to release a bit of a bandwidth. So I've heard everything you said. Okay, thanks for the summary. Even though we had the reverse order now, I think the arguments are good. And if I can summarize it in one word, or at least the positions are not that far away. It's rather the question whether it might be too early to start with the international level before the national level of open government, open data initiatives is well done. We have a number of questions there, and there are a couple of and comments that we'll take out. One is from Antoine, who basically thinks that both national and international levels are very important because the relevance based on national context keeps the same importance, same brightness at the international level. Teresa asks, how can you aim to have an impact on the open government, open data in the global context when there are significant shortcomings on the local and national level, and should it be built step by step, which probably goes along some of Jovan's arguments. And Nanayo says, when we mentioned of going step by step, says, I think all levels should wait in the same way. Let local levels play out alongside international, so both hand in hand, because they interrelate and they have different dynamics, different contexts, needs, approaches, and so on. I'll stop here, and I'll probably give the floor back to two of you. I might now reverse and give firstly the floor to Jovan, and then to Tim afterwards to conclude. Jovan, 3 minutes. I'm here watching you.
Back to Big Brother. Back to Antoine's comments, and I think the underlying point of our discussion is that it's not either-or situation. It's a question of more tactics than decisions should we develop it on national or international level. How to approach it, what is the timing, that aspect shouldn't be underestimated, because the question of timing and the question of whole process, nudging, way of introducing could be decisive for the success of an open data movement. Therefore, that's definitely this approach. I agreed with Teresa's approach that we should build up from the bottom up, from the local initiatives, and that's essentially two main comments. If I have this extra time, I would also try to highlight once more this institutional dynamics, and I will give you one example. There are meetings of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, and I'm sure that Kishan would be happy to hear about the Geneva dynamics. And those are meetings where countries get periodical review of their human rights situation. The periodical grilling of each country lasts for 3 hours, and very often, especially when you have a bit controversial periodical reviews, you can see the long queues in front of the UN gate in Preny. For those of you who know how where is the UN gate, basically the key is to have the friendly delegations and friendly countries speaking, getting the priority in order to speak and to cover these 3 hours by friendly comments about the human rights in particular country. This is the way how it's even on the level of registering in the Preny gate, it's a part of diplomatic dynamics. Therefore, we have so many layers where the open data, which open data movement has to take into account, and especially for this, I can call it diplomatic rituals and the relevance of reputation, which diplomats ultimately have to protect reputation of their respective countries. Over to you.
Thank you, Jovan. Now, Tim, 3 more minutes. I think you have good questions and good comments, and I think most of these comments which criticize in a way the national level before going into international, we should firstly make the national one work. That's probably a question for you, and I know that I shouldn't be saying this to you. Now you'll get the advantage, but the poll is quite equal, so now it's your chance to win the game. 3 minutes.
I can see it in front of me, so 60% undecided. We've got to try and swing you over this side. So I think where I'd start is on issues. Why do we do open data? What issues can it help us address? And the starting point would be there are some global issues where we're already collecting massive amounts of data, where international institutions are gathering and storing from national governments, from their own fieldwork, large quantities of data. And right now they're not sharing it. It's not openly available. So UN OCHA on humanitarian aid have all sorts of data that they're not allowed to share because they've signed proprietary license deals around it. So they're not sharing that and allowing collaboration to happen. So at the international institution layer, if we say these are an afterthought, we should wait until we've sorted out nations before we say to the UN, say to other institutions, open up your data, we're missing a lot of the potential. So that's the data that they already hold, and we can look at how institutions like the World Bank have been a first mover in this space and are shaping the structure of data that's out there and are shaping the conversations we can have because their data is more accessible than others, and we want to make sure there's a plurality of data from international institutions out there. So number one, we need to look at the global issues that matter and focus on opening that data up. When it comes to the national level, I think I would concede this shouldn't be about parachuting in open data initiatives to top down, saying, look, this was done in the US or in the UK. Other countries should adopt this and just top down implement what international institutions say open data should look like. It needs to be bottom up as well, but it can't just be bottom up. There needs to be a shared conversation, because while opening budget data in one country can allow accountability in that country, if there's no conversation going on about standardizing that data, we can't match the budget and the aid data from different countries and start uncovering information on which companies are avoiding tax in different states or how aid flows are operating. Now, that doesn't mean large-scale, heavy-duty diplomatic decision-making processes. I think we need to find lightweight, inclusive, multi-stakeholder processes for doing standardization, and we do need to make that standardization get beyond just being sort of the first mover techies, a sort of technocratic, meritocratic system, to one that is much more inclusive. And I think I'll leave it at that. I think those are the two key points. At the global level, there's big problems to be solved. The argument made at the national level is citizens are paid for this data, their government should release it. Well, that same thing works at the international level and potentially gives us a chance to bring some of these international institutions closer to citizens by citizens having a much more direct relationship with them as providers of data and information that both can be used every day and can be used in international problem solving. And I'm looking at the vote, I've not swung anyomes opinion, so I'll...
You even gave one argument for me. So thank you, Tim.
Well, the truth is, looking at the poll, is that you both of you were quite unpersuasive, because the support is like undecided at 60%. You wouldn't go for elections, I hope. 20% supporting, 20% are opposing, but some 60% are undecided, so I have to work better on this. But the truth is, the topic is quite interesting, and I wouldn't say that either of you, and I think you would agree, that either of you should be right or wrong in this. It's, again, a matter of time and the approach, how to synchronize national, international events, and how to approach to these open data and open government initiatives, which means a lot of checking on the best practices and listening to the national, international context in which we put it, as Tim well illustrated previously. Okay, thank you both. So once again, the poll was, or the debate was, statement was, open government, open data initiatives are more relevant in a national context and at international level, and the results as 20% support, 20% oppose, and undecided 60%. Thank you, Jovan. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, all of you. I think we had, well, for me at least, it was a very interesting day, and I hope you enjoyed at least as much as I have in this hour and a half now already. We'll not stop here. I remind you that this is just the beginning of our e-participation month. We will organize an e-participation day in June. You'll find more information on our website. We definitely invite you, if you will be around Geneva in these days, to join us. But all of your comments and all of these debate notes and conclusions will go into a research work that will present the results during the e-participation conference, and I hope we can make a better impact, but we'll definitely consult and open the results of this research and our future work to all of you in the spirit of open data and open government and e-participation, and also circulate via social media. I thank you all of you again, and I hope to see you soon again in a similar debate. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.